Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining another session for Lakehead International Live. My name is Laura Puttis, and I'm an international recruitment officer here at Lakehead University's beautiful Thunder Bay campus. And today I am joined by a professor from our Faculty of Education, Dr. Gary Pluim. Gary, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, hello everybody. I'll say good morning. For those of you who are experiencing morning right now, my name is Gary Pluim. I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the Aurelia campus at Lakehead University.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gary. So, with that, thank you again for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Laura. I see a number of people patching in from different parts of the world, so that's wonderful. Ghana, Colombia. Among other places, some people in Canada as well. As I mentioned, I'm at the Aurelia campus, and my specialty in the Faculty of Education is in intercultural education, social foundations of education. I'm very interested in global citizenship education. Our faculty offers a number of programs, and we have hundreds of students that move through our faculty every year, both at the Aurelia campus and in the Thunder Bay campus. So we run concurrent education programs. We have consecutive programs. We have programs that focus in Indigenous education, in technology and education. We offer additional qualifications in our program as well. And that's just at the undergraduate level, at the bachelor's level. We have master's degrees with specializations in areas such as social justice education, environment and sustainability in education. And we have a very exciting PhD program as well, in which we partner with Brock University and the University of Windsor. Um, and many of our students do one or more of these degrees in our Faculty of Education. So the field of education, for those of you who are not that familiar with the field, is looks at different components of teaching, of learning, of curriculum, pedagogy, policy, philosophy. And we don't look at just how students learn, but what and why they learn. And that's something I really wanted to focus on today, that not all knowledge is equal. This is a particular interest of mine. There's a philosophy of knowledge, there's a type of knowledge, there's a theory of knowledge that looks at constructivism, that knowledge is constructed, meaning that people construct their own understanding through reflecting on their experience and so on. So this is the constructed focus of the constructivism theory of knowledge. And in education, the way it relates to education is that we tend to teach this kind of knowledge, but there are many issues related to that. And so in my mock lecture today, I wanted to speak about this idea of constructivism with an entry point of maps. So thinking about the ways that maps influence the way we learn about the world and the way that students learn about the world. So I'm going to make the point here that maps are a social construct and that we learn so much implicitly and invisibly through the maps that we look at. One of the most prominent and recent examples, I think, is something that happened very recently in North America. When we look at our map of North America, we can see the continent many of us refer to as Turtle Island here. We see the big bodies of water, Pacific and the Atlantic on the east, and this big bay in the middle that traditionally we've known as the Gulf of Mexico. And this Gulf of Mexico, very recently, through the administration in the United States, changed its name. And through various levels of policy and promotions, changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. And so many maps are now reflecting this change. So, for example, if you look at this huge gulf, this huge inlet in which the Caribbean is situated, Mexico to the south, the United States to the north. In the United States, it's now termed the Gulf of America. In Mexico, it's still termed the Gulf of Mexico. But in the rest of the world, maps will write these as the Gulf of Mexico with the Gulf of America in brackets. And many of us across the continent have said, wait, can they just do this? Can they just change a name like this? That's not possible. You can't just change names of places. But the actual reality is, yeah, you can. And it actually happens all over the world, and it's happened throughout time and in different places of the world. So, for example, if you look at maps of the Far East, depending on where you are, you'll see the East Sea if you're in East Asia. But you'll see the Sea of Japan if you're looking at a map in Japan. If you're in India, for example, you might see a map of India that looks like this, with Jammu and Kashmir as part of India. Um, if you're looking at a global map of the world, so for example, in a Google map, you'll see that area with dotted lines. And if you're looking at maps in Pakistan, you'll see that area as part of Pakistan. So there are political reasons. And this, of course, is coming to the fore right now with conflict that we're seeing between India and Pakistan. Russia in Ukraine, we'll see something similar. So a map in Russia and a map in the Ukraine will show Crimea as belonging to each of these different countries. So depending on where we are in the world, we'll see different areas and territories belonging to different countries in the world. We'll see different borders, and oftentimes we'll see different names. So maps that we use in education, that we use in teaching, are far from neutral. And this is one really prominent example, I think. And many of you would probably have different examples as well. I'd be interested in the chat if you could name and share some other examples of that around the world that you're aware of, where different countries or different parts of the world, political states use different names and different borders to align with different parts of the world. But it goes far beyond that. It goes far beyond that as well. So when we think about this map on the wall that many students around the world will use in their classrooms to be able to learn about the world, what I'm going to argue is this is something that we often take as something that's very neutral, like something that we just take for granted. Many of us in Canada, for example, would be familiar with these kinds of classrooms with a teacher at the front of the class that looks at the map, and we understand the world through this map that's on the wall. But there's one, to begin with, there's one really basic problem with this map of the world, and that is what we're doing is we're trying to reflect something in a two-dimensional sphere that's actually a two-dimensional representation that actually in the physical world is actually a sphere. So when we look at a map of the world that looks like this on the wall, what we're actually doing is we're taking something that's a sphere like this, right? So this this Earth that hurtles through space, rotating on its axis, is actually a sphere. And what we're doing with this sphere is we're trying to make a two-dimensional representation of this. And there are many, many problems with taking this sphere and making it into a two-dimensional representation. And maybe in your mind you could try and imagine that. If you were to take this globe and take the surface of the earth and put it on the wall, what would that look like? I'm just finishing my breakfast here, and with this grapefruit, for example, I could take this as an example, and you can start to see what happens. Um, Beyond the fact that I'm spilling grapefruit juice all over my computer right now, if I pull this across, what do you see that's happening to the grapefruit? What do you notice that's happening to this kind of representation of this sphere, right? Well, you can see that it's bulging out in different areas, right? It's has a problem becoming flat because of the roundness, the spherical shape of it. People talk about this as squaring the sphere, the issue of squaring the sphere, right? And when we do this, if we actually tried to lay this out, we would have something that looks like this, right? A map of the world that looks like this. It would be a little bit rounded, and it'd be much, much harder to teach from, right? Something like this. Instead, what we have on the wall is something like this. So what they've done with this map of the world is they've actually started to fill in places around the world. And there are big problems with this because as we pull this map apart, as we pull this sphere apart and fill in different areas, it actually means that different parts of the world are given much bigger representations around the world. Some people refer to this as the Greenland problem, right? So Greenland is actually on a two-dimensional map represented much, much bigger than different parts of the world, right? In actual fact, the continent of Africa is 14 times the size of Greenland. But on this map, it looks like they're about the same size. You'll see other issues with this map. I mean, Antarctica alone looks massive, right, on this. South America is actually twice the size of Europe, but on this map, they look about the same. Mexico is larger than Alaska, but on this map, it looks quite a bit different. And what happens in this kind of map is when we expand it in this direction, when latitude increases, the distortion increases as well, right? So the shape of these places are right along the meridians, but the proportions of the continents and the areas are not right. So it enlarges areas as we get closer to the poles. So when we look at a map like this, it's representative along the equator, but as we get closer to the poles, we see much, much bigger proportions. So historically, this comes from the Mercator projection that Gerardus Mercator used in exploration times when he saw these same kind of problems, but decided that for nautical purposes and for purposes of exploration, this Mercator projection of the world is going to be quite a bit more useful, right? There's a really neat website called the truesizeof.com in which you can actually take different countries. You can pick a country and move it to different parts of the world. So Russia, for example, if you were to move Russia to the equator, you can actually see its true size relative to those countries along the equator in that part of the world. Equally, if you look at the continent of Africa, and you move different countries in there, you can see that you can fit all of these countries, the United States, China, India, Italy, France, Germany, and more, right into the continent of Africa. On a globe, you'll actually see this, that the continent of Africa is massive, right? But on a wall projection of the map of the world, it doesn't look like this at all, right? And there are problems with this because intuitively we often equate size with importance, right? So when we look at a map of the world and we look at what's centered in the world, we'll equate that with size and importance. So there are different ways that people have tried to correct for these projections of the world. So we have the Gall-Peters projection, for example, which which will look at the world with a much more accurate representation of size. However, the shape of these places, of these continents, are not quite as accurate. But you can see, for example, the continent of Africa, for example, relative to Greenland, is a much more accurate in terms of size, right? The Gall-Peters projection here, you can see now has countries overlaid with it. So you can get a sense of different sizes of countries. Um, so projections of maps have lots of implicit messages when we look at them. So, for example, on the Mercator projection that we looked at before, Europe tends to look much, much bigger on the map than it does in a Gall-Peters projection. So a map like this actually shows the prominence of Asia, for example, in terms of size, the prominence of Africa, the prominence of South America. And we can see Europe is much smaller here, and even Canada is much smaller than it is on some of these other projections. Right? The orthograph world map looks to try to correct some of these things. So this map was developed by a Japanese architect in 1999, and it equally divides the spherical surface into 96 triangles. In 2011, this map won the National Museum of Emerging Sciences award as an official mapping tool. So there's some other maps that try to correct this while still being able to project in two dimensions. The Dymaxion map, for example, is another map that projects the world map on the surface as an icosahedron. It can be unfolded and flattened into various dimensions. Um, and it's interrupted to preserve various shapes. A lot of these maps, though, as we look at them, such as these other possibilities that try to correct for the unfolding of the sphere, the cylindrical map, the conical map, the polyconical map, for example. So we can see what they've done is they've tried to correct for the sphere unfolding onto the two dimensions. They're useful, but sometimes they can be hard to use. So maps inherently, when we try to square the sphere, have these different kinds of problems associated with it. But typically, what we use is the Mercator map. This is the map that we're left with in many, many classrooms. Many of us are familiar with this map. But the point I'm trying to argue here is that this creates many problems, and it creates problems in education when young children grow up with these maps, when we learn with these maps, and we don't look at them critically. We don't understand the politics behind the maps. So what's centered on the map, for example, what's large on the map, the implicit meanings of positionality on the maps. Some people refer to this as cartographic imperialism. So implicit ways in which we center importance and and peripheries, for examples, on maps. So this map, another way of looking at map is what's in the center. So this map actually, instead of putting Europe at the center, which is where we learn this term Eurocentrism, which many world maps will have Europe at the center, this has the United States and Canada at the center, right? So this is a map we'll see in Canada, which centers Canada and reinforces its prominence in the world. In China, um, some maps will center China like this. So there are schools that you can go to in China that will have a sinocentric map of the world that looks like this, right? So you'll see China in the center. You'll see different parts of the rest of the world off to the periphery. So subtly, implicitly, even invisibly, our eyes go to the center of the map to understand what has prominence. I like this one. It even takes off a big part of the Western Hemisphere, right? So this map actually cuts off all of South America. Australian, an Australian map of the world. So the Bly revised map of the world actually takes Australia and puts it at the center. But not only that, you'll notice something else about this map, and it flips the map upside down. Right? So it has the south as the center of the map of the world. And this this is can also be sort of a political posturing for maps of the world too, to suggest that the South can be at the top. There's nothing to say, for example, if we go back to our globe, that the bottom of that our top of the Earth, the North, is the top and the South is the bottom, right? In space, there's no top and bottom that way, right? But Australians have responded to it this way, including Joaquin Torres Garcia's America Invertida map, right? These kind of south up maps, right? So this map came out in the 1900s, where Torres Garcia placed the South Pole at the top of the Earth, suggesting a visual affirmation of the importance of the South American continent, right? Much later in the New Yorker in 1992, this Happy Penguin cartoon came out looking at the upside down globe, right? In my classrooms, when I teach, I'll often have a globe in my on my desk, and I'll put it deliberately upside down. It's sort of a talking point. So students can say, "Hey, your globe is upside down." And then we'll say, "Really? Is it upside down? Or is that just another way of looking at the world?" Right? So there's many things that are implicit in terms of maps and how we use maps and how we can sort of challenge the dominant looking at maps. This video game that came out by Seth Alter, some of you might know it. It's called Neocolonialism. It's sort of a virtual game of Risk. Deliberately flips the world into this axis, right? So we look at this axis as a way to kind of challenge and unsettle the way we look at the world and the way we understand the world. I don't know about you, but when I look at upside down maps, I almost have to like turn my head upside down to look at to make sense of it. But that's just because I've been so conditioned throughout my life to look at maps in the way that I do, right? So Google has responded to this in recent years. So you move from Google Maps to Google Earth, and you can actually change your settings so that when you zoom out in Google Earth, that you can see a globe instead of the Earth. So traditionally and originally, Google defaulted to the Mercator projection, where it had these big errors at the north and the south. You can try it right now on your own computers if you'd like to see what happens with Google when you do that. And you can change your setting so that you get the spherical position, right? So social constructions are everywhere in education because we tend to teach about the way that humans have come to understand knowledge and the world. So social constructions are a category created and developed by society. And what I'm arguing here is maps and geography is one of those categories. Things that we teach in schools, in education. And comparatively, by the way, we do this a little bit different in each country, right? But for the most part, these are things that are implicit and not visible to the learners. A social construction is a perception or idea that's constructed through cultural or social practice. These things that we share implicitly with each other. And education is one of the big drivers of that. So here at Lakehead in the Faculty of Education is one thing we try to do is uncover these. We try to unpack them. We try and make them visible. We do this through research. We do this through teaching. We do this through sharing ideas, through conferences, and so on. So as we're doing this, you might have been thinking about the origins of maps and the way maps have come to be. And a historical perspective on maps is a really interesting entry point into this as well. Some of the first maps of the world included the Babylonian map of the world, which came out in 600 BC or around then. It really centered Babylon and the Euphrates River, but they're depicted at the center of this map, right? It's got the neighboring cities of Assyria and Susa on this map, and outer cities um, are shown as small circular blobs on this map. So even since the origins of time, maps have had to center one place versus another, right? And by doing that, that's where we show priorities. The Da Ming Han Yi 2 map is one of the earliest surviving maps from the Far East. Um, it's dated back to around 1389, and it was drawn on silk, on this silk map. And so it represented some of the early passages of the Silk Road, but it also distorts various land masses. So it shows China as a monolith in that part of the world. Um, and it shows Japan, it shows Korea, but all of those places are much larger than in India. Um, there's the Cantino Planisphere map, which came out in 1502, commissioned by an Italian duke. It's one of the earliest maps to show the coastline of Portugal. Um, sorry, Portugal's New World territories in South America. And it starts to show areas of Cuba, Hispaniola, and parts of the American coast. We spoke earlier about the Mercator projection. So when Gerardus Mercator sketched this map when he did his cross-Atlantic sails in the 16th century, you'll see this map that came out. So some of these earlier sketches had very different depictions of the world that wasn't as known much to Europeans, but it accounted for these errors, and it's the map that we base most of our maps today on. Over time, different kinds of maps had continued to have different kinds of biases. And through time, some were unashamedly used as propaganda. So, for example, this Federation map, produced in 1886, really showed the British Commonwealth, Britain's possessions. There's artwork around its borders that you'll know, and it depicts people from England different than people from the colonies in very, very different ways, in very kind of subservient ways. You'll see how England's at the center of this map and how people are facing the center. Um, and so maps like this came out with the illusion of it being for navigation, but it was actually used more for propaganda when it was distributed to the different colonies. It embellishes the size of the grandeur of the empire using cartography. So maps can do these kinds of things, like this map, for example, that came out during the war. It was used in Germany to generate public support against the country's empires, the country's enemies, I should say, the Allies, for example. And eventually we've moved on to maps like this of the world where most of us are familiar. Um, There's also very different kinds of maps, and I wanted to conclude with that to show that we also can use maps in very, very different ways. So we typically assume that maps are going to show a political representation of the world. In other words, they show the countries of the world. But keep in mind that countries are also social constructions, right? The idea that we have lines between countries, that we have borders between countries. Historically, this looked very, very different. Certainly before the colonial eras, where European countries carved up much of the world in colonial states, right? We're reminded of that today when our neighbors to the south in the United States are talking about Canada as a 51st state, that the border is arbitrary. And in fact, there is some truth to that. Many borders around the world are somewhat arbitrary, but they've been carved out in different ways. But the point here is to say most maps we see of the world, or many maps that we're familiar with, show countries of the world, right? We could have maps that show population representation. So it's another way of thinking about the world where we see a map of the world and it shows places in the world based on population. And this gives us a really different representation of the world that we live in. Something like this is builds off the ladder, but you can actually see places like India and China are huge on this map because of the numbers of people that live there, right? Likewise, Indonesia, Nigeria, Brazil. For Canadians looking at this map, we can barely see our country because it's just this thin slice at the northern part of the world. relative to the size of the physical size of our country, our population is very small, right? We could look at a map that shows what side of the world people drive on. So the blue countries, people drive on the left. The red countries, people drive on the right. In education, a map like this can be really useful to show students because it starts to develop a conversation about why that's the case and the fact that the side of the road that we drive on is a social construction as well. But there are political connections. You might notice some connections with these countries and the reasons why they drive on the left side of the road, and in the red countries, they drive on the right side of the road, right? You might notice the connection to Great Britain. You might think about colonization during the time of the Industrial Revolution, the development of cars, of roads and infrastructure, and how roads developed that way. We have good conversations in our classrooms in Canada why Canada, as a country that was colonized by the British, where we drive on the right, as opposed to many other Commonwealth countries. And we talk about our proximity to the United States and so on, and how those decisions were made differently. Popular sports in each country. Many of us in our own nations think our sport is popular all over the world. Certainly, many hockey fans in Canada think about hockey as the prominent and only sport in the world, and we're surprised to see that we're the only or one of the only countries in the world where hockey is the most popular sport. Likewise, in the United States, where American football is so popular, and when people talk about football, they don't think that football for most of the world is what we call soccer in North America, and that's what's so popular. There's basketball, there's cricket, um, there's archery in some places as well, right? Speed bumps, a map that looks at how roads and speed limits can be associated with economies in different kinds of different parts of the world. So you could take a map like this and correlate it to another map that looks at the gross domestic product of countries around the world. Right? So maps can represent lots of different things. They can represent populations, economies, sports. You can make connections between maps, like this one, for example, like light pollution around the world. So if we were to take that last map, for example, of GDP and look at this map, which is a view from space at how light is emitted within the world, we can see that there's a huge disproportion of the amount of light pollution that comes from different countries. So we can see the prominence of the eastern parts of North America, for example, of Europe, and a little bit of Eastern Asia, and how surprisingly or strikingly darker it is across much of the continent of Africa, of Australia, even the Pacific, and much parts of South America. In contrast to GDP, there are other metrics that look at the most and least happy countries of the world. So that the Global Happiness Report, for example, that ranks countries based on happiness. We can look at countries based on coffee consumption. And a map like this, where we see dark areas of the world where people drink lots of coffee, as some of us are sitting here in the morning with our cup of coffee next to us, and we might think about how that's a cultural construction as well. But we might also think about where our coffees come from too, where those beans come from, and where those big green dots on the map on the left side indicate who drinks the most coffee, but where those coffee beans are picked from and our global connections around the world. So the implications of that, likewise, for example, McDonald's, eating McDonald's and who consumes products at McDonald's and where those raw materials, where that food, where the styrofoam, where the packaging comes from, and so on. Right? There's good connections too that we can look at maps as infographics and as information about the changing climates and about extreme temperatures. So um, areas in the world that are marked in red here have had extreme temperatures over 48 degrees Celsius. In blue, extreme temperatures under 48 degrees Celsius. And dark, uh, the countries in black and the parts of the world in black have had both. So below 48 degrees, minus 48 degrees Celsius, and above plus 48 degrees Celsius. So we can see the areas of threat in our world and how that correlates to productions and so on. But at the end of the day, we use maps in different parts of the world, and there's lots of things that we can denote on maps. So in having this conversation today, I hope you'll have a chance to think a little bit next time you look at a map of the world, what's on it and what choices the map maker had to decide in producing that map in terms of what's in the middle, um, what is large and what's small. So the proportions, what type of map they've used, which way it's oriented, up versus down, what information they're choosing to put on this map, whether it's used for information or for propaganda, and so on. So many, many things that are conveyed through this map that we often think is a very sort of neutral, and unassuming, um, piece of knowledge and piece of curriculum. Maps influence the way we learn about the world. And a sphere that we looked at, like the Earth, this globe, it doesn't easily translate into two dimensions that we put on the wall. Maps look different depending on one's national perspective. Maps change over time. And cartography is an example of a social construction. Students learn about the world that they live in through maps. So I will stop there for now, and thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to carry on this discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pluim. That was so very interesting. I think, especially for the audience that we have tuning in today from all over the world. And I think if we were all in person, we would definitely be having some very active and critical discussions, but we do have the Q&A, so that will have to do for today. So I notice we have a few questions that have come through already for our audience. If you do have any questions, now is the time to think about those and type those out. But before we get to the student questions, I actually had a question myself that came to mind when you were speaking. So I'm just wondering, the dominant map projection that I think was created, was it in the 1500s? So years and years ago. Why do you think that hasn't changed with new technology that actually allows us to see a more accurate scale of the world?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there are a couple things that we look at in studies of sociology of education, for example. So one is just the strength of tradition, right? So the strength of tradition, and once something is created, it's very, very hard to change after it's created. And that doesn't apply just to maps, but it applies to so many things around the world, right? So we looked at, for example, which side of the world we drive on, the right side or the left side, right? So once we have that, ingrained, and we have our urban strategies, and we mass produce cars with steering wheels on one side or the other, we continue on that path. You could say the same for, I often think about the metric system and how useful it is versus other kinds of measurement systems, right? That are um, like imperial systems, for example, and how hard it is to switch. So, for example, countries that still use imperial systems, it makes more sense to move something, to change to something that's more, practical. But the tradition is just so strong, and with that are the vested interests in everybody, in every company, really, in every institution that will profit off this, right? And so I think, like Martin, for example, asked this question, are these misrepresentations of the size of land in the map politically motivated, like the examples you mentioned earlier? And I think there's a difference between, like, I think a theorist would say, yes, they are. Like there's somebody behind these to to make sure that their interests are propagated. But I think the sociologists would say, well, yeah, they are politically motivated, but it's not one person. It's just it's like a huge group of people over time that profit from these representations and therefore won't go through great lengths to change them.
Right, that's interesting. Kind of on the same vein, we had another question come through the Q&A that asks, how might a map influence the way we see power or importance among countries, especially with the difference of the 2D and 3D map?
Yeah. I don't see, oh, did that come in? I don't see it in the chat here, this that question.
In the Q&A from Sean Nobby. I can repeat it if you like.
Sorry, I see it there. Sorry
Okay.
about that. Yeah. How might a map influence the way we see power or importance amongst countries? Well, I think that's exactly it. I think it it does, and what you can do is sort of unpack that from different dimensions, and there's different research that would attest to that. Um, and those were the points I'm trying to make in this talk. So, for example, the idea of um, like when we talk about something being Eurocentric, right, or Eurocentricism, it's often taken as symbolic or a figurative connection um, that we see the world through a European lens, right? And that could come through the languages that we use, right? The predominant languages at United Nations, for example, the predominant languages that we use in various forms of culture. It could be Eurocentricism in terms of the scholars that we read. So in many university disciplines, we will read, the canon, the canons of those disciplines that typically very often come from Europe. But Eurocentricism can have a very literal meaning on a map, and that is when Europe is placed right at the middle of the map, right? And just like these other social conventions, these social constructions, we don't often question them unless we're taking a critical approach, unless we have a social justice approach to what we're looking at. So this question, how might a map influence the way we see power or importance amongst countries? It can often do that subtly, invisibly, and implicitly. So depending on what's in the middle of the map, depending on whether with the orientation of the map, depending on the positionality of the map, so what is skewed. So for example, Canada profits from the Mercator projection because it makes Canada look bigger, right? Europe profits from that. It makes Europe look bigger. But then there's all sorts of other things. So the language on the map. So which language are we choosing to mark different countries in? Um, uh, which and by contrast, whether we choose to represent countries that don't use that language in their own language or the dominant language on the map. Just one other thought on that. So Google, for example, I think to its credit, if you go to different parts of the world using Google Earth, you can start to see different places in the world using their local languages that are denoted on a map, right? So there are different ways that we can, um, you know, have, take a decolonial lens on cartography through these kinds of representations.
That's really interesting. There's so much deeper and hidden meaning that we can pick up. We had another question come through from Martin, and
Mhm.
he asks, why aren't any of these alternate maps taught in academia? And I wanted to add kind of a part two to this question. I'm just
Yeah.
wondering if you know of any, social movements that are like pushing for that change in education and so forth.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I can't think of an organized movement, so I'll just start at the end with your question there. But there's lots of sort of subtle, kind of grassroots efforts. So one thing that, for example, that I teach my students or work with my students, is to remind them that when they're the teacher in a classroom, they have a lot of power. Like as educators, we have a lot of power. We have a lot of agency to step into a classroom and teach this to our students, right? You know, like which goes to Martin's question, like why weren't we taught these? Why weren't these taught in academia? And I think for for the large part is many academics either aren't aware of this themselves, right? Or many teachers, many don't think to address it. Um, in many occasions it's really difficult because if you want to try to get a map, it's actually hard to source many of these alternative maps, right? Because the Mercator projection is so predominant. So for example, I teach social studies at the university, social studies education, and I just ordered a map for my classroom, but it was very difficult to find a map that I could put up on the wall that isn't the Mercator projection and isn't a political projection that kind of attends to all of these things. So what I like to try and find is a physical map of the world that has a projection, and the name of this map escapes me right now, but it actually rounds the corners at the top and the bottom of the map, so at the north and the south. So because it rounds, it sort of brings in the areas, the land masses to a more sort of appropriate size or proportionate size. Um, so that's one of the reasons is it's actually hard to come by. But I think with the with different movements, with that video game I showed you, with different kind of some of the things that Google is doing, like we're starting to see that there are different representations out there. But like any kind of efforts towards social justice, it is incumbent on the educator to take those extra steps to source those resources, to find books that aren't from the canon, to find more diverse representations. It's more work for sure. And
Yeah,
that's maybe sometimes what it boils down to.
right. Can you remind us of the name of that video game so I can put it in the chat for
Yeah,
attendees?
I think it's called neocolonialism.
Neocolonialism. Definitely
Yeah.
going to check that out. So we just have a couple more minutes left. There are a few more questions in the Q&A, Dr. Pluim, if there's any of them you want to answer before we wrap up. Um, I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, Alex's question is, do you think we should keep using traditional map or should we promote using map with the correct scale, using a neutral point as the center? So I think yes, like to the latter, we shouldn't keep using the traditional map. But what I like to do is use lots of different maps and different representations because every map will have a problem with it, right? So like the Gall-Peters projection doesn't show the actual shape of these places, right? The Dymaxion map is problematic as well, just in terms of looking at it, right? So we always have to make choices. So part of that is, so I think using a map, but using it within the context and spending some time, if you're a teacher, contextualizing that map with your students to say, okay, we're going to use this map. Here's the advantages of it, but here are the problems with it.
I think with that, unless there are any other burning questions that come through, we are almost at time here. So I want to thank you again, Dr. Pluim, for your lecture. It was very interesting to me personally, but I can tell by the Q&A, engaged a lot of our prospective students too. So thank you so much again. And to the attendees, we really appreciate you joining us for our first lecture showcase of the series. Again, we are going to be running these the next couple of Tuesdays, so please do tune into those. And with that, we'll let everyone go. Thank you again for attending, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks for the great questions too. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.